Mr. Roberts lasted 30 episodes in 1965 and is barely remembered today. The 8 men who filled out its crew went on to wildly different ends. One was buried at sea. Another is a household name you would recognize instantly. 6 are no longer living. Their stories begin now. Our first stop is the man whose name sat in the title, Roger Smith, who played Lieutenant Douglas Roberts. He was the decent officer trapped on a rusting cargo ship, aching for real war duty while shielding his men from a small-minded captain. Where the film version of Roberts simmered with frustration, Smith played him smoother and lighter, a matinee handsome anchor for the comedy happening around him. Audiences in 1965 already knew that face because Smith had spent 5 seasons as the slick private detective Jeff Spencer on 77 Sunset Strip, one of the coolest shows on television. He had also played the grown Patrick Dennis in the film Auntie Mame, and both Columbia and Warner Brothers had groomed him as a leading man. Beyond acting, he wrote scripts for his own detective series and even released a record album, the kind of all-around showman the studios prized. There is a detail about how he got into acting that turns this whole series into a kind of circle. As a young man, Smith served in the Naval Reserve, and while stationed in Hawaii, he met James Cagney, who told him to try Hollywood. Cagney liked him enough to hire him to play his own son in a picture. And Cagney, of course, had played the tyrant captain in the 1955 movie version of Mr. Roberts. So the young man that Cagney pushed toward acting grew up to play the title role in the television version of the very story Cagney had starred in, a coincidence almost too neat to be true. Cagney had a habit of spotting young talent, and Smith was one of his finds who actually made it. His career kept getting interrupted by his own body. In the early 1960s, he collapsed at home and was found to have a blood clot on the brain, an emergency that forced him out of 77 Sunset Strip and nearly ended everything. Then came myasthenia gravis, a disease that scrambles the signals between nerve and muscle and leaves a person weak. It would shadow him for the rest of his life and eventually pull him away from acting for good. Through all of it, he kept a public dignity, rarely complaining about the body that kept betraying him. What he did next is one of the gentlest second acts in Hollywood. Smith married the actress and dancer Anne Margaret in 1967, after proposing during a horse-drawn carriage ride through Central Park, and he quietly set his own career aside to manage hers. He once admitted that he did not believe a man could hold his own career and stay married to a hugely successful actress at the same time, and he made his choice without bitterness. Somehow, he seemed to take more pride in her success than he had ever taken in his own. Then he produced her television specials, guided her decisions, and stood in her corner for 50 years. They reached their golden anniversary in May of 2017, with Anne Margaret nursing him through the worst of the disease. Roger Smith died only weeks after that anniversary, on the 4th of June, 2017, at a hospital in Sherman Oaks, from complications of the illness he had carried for decades. He was 84, and he rests at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. Lieutenant Roberts spent the whole story desperate to leave his post for something bigger. The man who played him did the exact opposite with his life, choosing to stand just out of frame so the person he loved could have the spotlight. Almost nobody watching in 1965 would have picked the second man out of the crowd. John McCook played Seaman Stefanovsky, a face in the back ranks, one of the anonymous sailors with a handful of lines, and he was only 21 years old. Here is the part that should stop you. Of all 8 men who crewed that ship, John McCook is the only one still reporting to a studio in 2026. He had come up through the last of the old Hollywood system. The studio chief Jack Warner discovered him playing Tony in a New York revival of West Side Story, signed him, and then the Army drafted him for 2 years. For more than a decade after that, he collected small parts, this very series among them, waiting for something to land. It finally came in 1976, when The Young and the Restless cast him as the romantic lead Lance Prentice and gave him a name at last. For an actor who had spent a dozen years as a face in crowds, that single soap role changed everything. Then, in 1987, he took the role that swallowed the rest of his life in the best possible way. He became Eric Forrester, the fashion patriarch at the center of The Bold and the Beautiful from the show's very first episode, and he has played that man for nearly 40 years. In 2022, he finally won the Daytime Emmy for lead actor, after 4 nominations across the decades. The award arrived when he was nearly 80, a reward for staying in one chair longer than almost anyone in daytime. By December of 2025, the writers were throwing his character a retirement party, and fans panicked that he was leaving. He told them plainly that he had no reason to go anywhere. His private life held its own quiet drama. McCook married 3 times, and the middle marriage was to the dancer Juliette Prowse, a woman who had once turned heads opposite Sinatra and Presley. Prowse had been a true headliner in Las Vegas, and the marriage placed McCook for a few years beside a fame much larger than his own. Since 1980, he has been married to the actress Lorette Spong, and one of his 4 children, Molly McCook, grew up to act on network television herself. Even now, the writers keep building stories around him, including a recent one about ageism that he asked for, a man of a certain age fighting to stay relevant in a young business. Picture the call sheet from 1965 one more time. The star, the captain, the doctor, and the comic ensign were all printed at the top, while the seamen were listed somewhere down at the bottom. That man at the bottom outlived the careers of everyone above him and is, this year, still walking onto a soundstage. Eric Forrester rules a fashion empire that exists only on a set, and the actor who plays him turned the lowest billing on a forgotten flop into the longest run any of them ever had. Some of these men carried famous names that did them very little good. A name can be a gift and a burden at once, and this man inherited both. Richard Sinatra, who played Seaman D'Angelo across 9 episodes, was a young relative of Frank Sinatra. His father was Ray Sinatra, an Italian-born bandleader and a cousin of Frank's, best known as the music director for the singer Mario Lanza. So Richard grew up beside the most famous voice of the century, sharing the single most famous surname in American entertainment. The name carried a kind of weight no audition could match, and a kind of shadow no actor could escape. That name opened a few doors and very few more. Across the 1950s and 1960s, he logged only about 15 credits, most of them a single episode here and there. He turned up on Hogan's Heroes, on Gomer Pyle, on Gidget, and in Frank's own war film, None But the Brave. Each part was small, a sergeant here, a seaman there, the kind of work that fills a career without ever building one. In 1966, he married the actress Linda Marsh at the Beverly Hills Hotel, a woman who had earned a Golden Globe nomination for the film America, America, and for a moment the future looked bright. Even the wedding hinted at a Hollywood life that never quite arrived. It did not lead far. Richard Sinatra died in 1979 in the Los Angeles area, at the age of 43. The cause never became public, and there is no record of where he was laid to rest, which is its own quiet cruelty for a man with that surname. He carried the name Sinatra through a long string of one-line parts and was gone before his mid-40s, while the cousin who shared it lived nearly 2 more decades as a global star whose passing the whole country mourned. Sometimes the most famous name in the room belongs to the person history forgets first. If you remember Richard Sinatra from any of those small appearances, or if someone in your family ever pointed at the screen and said that man was a Sinatra, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. The captain of the Reluctant was played by a man who had spent 12 years giving orders for real. Richard X. Slattery took the role of Captain John Morton, the blustering tyrant that James Cagney had owned in the movie, and he made the menace feel genuine because it was. From 1948 to 1960, before any of this, Slattery walked a beat as a New York City police officer. He had a square jaw and a low, gravelly voice, and he learned his craft in police academy training films and in Bronx community theater. Off-Broadway, he had even appeared in heavy dramas like The Iceman Cometh long before Hollywood ever called. He carried that hard-earned authority into every uniform he ever wore on camera. Stardom never found him, but he became one of those faces you saw everywhere. He turned up on Bonanza, on Bewitched, on The Andy Griffith Show, and he played Admiral Halsey in the war miniseries The Winds of War. On the big screen, he showed up in The Boston Strangler and Walking Tall, almost always cast as the cop, the sergeant, or the heavy. His steadiest paycheck, though, came from somewhere nobody would expect. For 17 years, he played a friendly gas station attendant named Murph in a long run of television commercials, a role that put him in more living rooms than any drama ever did. Children who never watched a single one of his films could recognize Murph in a heartbeat. Slattery died in January of 1997, at the age of 71, at the Motion Picture and Television Hospital in Woodland Hills after a stroke. What happened next suited him perfectly. His family carried him out past the coast and buried him at sea off Catalina Island. He left behind his wife and 8 children, and one of his sons grew up to produce television himself. Captain Morton clung to a single palm tree on the deck as proof of his own importance. The man who played him needed no monument at all, and slipped instead beneath the Pacific. A tall man, with a deep voice and careful old-style diction, played the ship's doctor, and his name was George Ives. His doc was underplayed and warm, an unhurried presence in the middle of the chaos. He was stepping into a part William Powell had made unforgettable on film, and he chose to make it quietly his own rather than imitate a giant. Where Powell had been all silver charm, Ives offered something steadier and kinder. His life had brushed against real Hollywood history. Ives made his screen debut back in 1952 in Niagara, the thriller that helped turn Marilyn Monroe into a star, and he had worked on Broadway since the 1940s. On that stage, he had even supplied the offstage voice of a married man's conscience in The 7-Year Itch. For half a century, he kept going. On The Beverly Hillbillies, on Get Smart, on Bewitched, all the way into the 2000s, and a generation of younger fans knew him only from a strange, funny mock introduction he recorded for a home release of The Big Lebowski. He was the sort of actor whose face you trusted without ever learning his name. Then he did something most actors never do. In the early 1970s, Actors Equity asked him to take an executive post, and he became the union's Western Regional Director, spending years protecting the pay and conditions of other performers, which left him little time to perform himself. George Ives died at his Brentwood home in February of 2013 at the age of 87. The actor who played the man patching up the crew spent his later years patching up an entire profession, looking after the people standing in the spotlight he had stepped out of. People who still remember these faces are exactly who this channel is built for, so think about subscribing. There are many more crews left to find. One name on this call sheet went on to become more famous than the entire regular cast combined, and most people have no idea he was ever here. George Takei appeared in 2 1965 episodes as a Japanese officer named Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka, one of the narrow handful of parts Hollywood offered Asian American actors in that era. A single year later, he walked into a meeting with the producer Gene Roddenberry, won the role of Hikaru Sulu, and took the helm of the Starship Enterprise. The jump from this sinking comedy to that gleaming bridge took barely 12 months. What makes his presence on a wartime comedy so haunting is what the war had already done to him. As a small boy, Takei and his family were rounded up and imprisoned in American internment camps. He spent ages 5 to 8 behind barbed wire, in Arkansas and then Northern California, while his father served as a block captain and tried to hold the frightened community together. The man playing a war officer for laughs in 1965 had, as a child, been jailed by his own country during that very war. Few details in this whole story land harder than that one. He had taken the long road to that ship. After studying architecture to please his father, Takei turned to acting instead and earned 2 degrees from UCLA, and he made his film debut in 1960 opposite Richard Burton in Ice Palace. Star Trek then ran only 3 seasons to poor ratings, caught fire in syndication, and never let go. And Takei carried Sulu into 6 feature films. Those years made him part of one of the most enduring stories in television, and the conventions and movies kept him in front of fans for the rest of his life. He earned a high honor from the Emperor of Japan and helped found the Japanese-American National Museum, where he later married his longtime partner Brad in 2008. From a barbed wire camp to the bridge of a starship to a museum he helped build, his life has bent steadily toward the light. Out of that childhood imprisonment, he built a Broadway musical and a memoir, and he pushed for the formal apology his country finally issued in 1988. George Takei is alive in 2026, 89 years old, reaching millions of people every day and still speaking out for the causes he holds dear. He belongs to the last living generation that can describe those camps from memory. Again and again he has written about that childhood, determined that no one forgets what happened. A young actor who once played a small wartime part on a show nobody remembers became one of the most recognizable people on the planet, and one of the most stubborn keepers of an ugly truth his country would rather forget. The funniest man on The Reluctant was the one who later disappeared the most completely. Steve Harmon played Ensign Frank Pulver, the scheming, girl-chasing morale officer, the role that had won Jack Lemmon an Academy Award in the movie. Critics watching the series singled Harmon out as its real spark, the comic engine the writers leaned on once the lead role had been softened. On a show built around a quieter Roberts, he was the one the audience actually waited for. He was 24, sharp, and clearly the breakout of the cast. For a brief season, he was the name people repeated the morning after. Performing had filled nearly his whole life. As a child, he appeared on Broadway, and he sang and danced on variety programs like The Ed Sullivan Show before he was old enough to drive. After this series, he picked up a few more parts, on Another World and on That Girl, and then the work simply thinned out and stopped. There was no scandal and no farewell, only a career that gradually went quiet. Where he went is the quiet heartbreak of his story. Steve Harmon left the business and the mainland behind, and he died in 2008 at the age of 67, in Kailua on the island of Oahu, far from the studios that once built whole episodes around his timing. No cause was ever made public. The brightest comic talent on that ship spent his final years on a Hawaiian beach, anonymous to the audiences who had once laughed at every line he delivered. Our final seaman had already done the finest work of his career before he ever boarded this ship. Ron Starr played Seaman Mannion in 9 episodes, another face in the comic crew, yet 3 years earlier he had appeared in Sam Peckinpah's Ride the High Country, a western now regarded as a classic. Sharing the screen with Joel McCrea and Randolph Scott, he was working beside 2 of the biggest names the genre ever produced and pointed straight up. That film was Peckinpah's breakthrough, the one that announced a major director, and Starr was right there inside it. For one shining moment, he shared the frame with the men who built the Western. The climb never came. After the early peak, he drifted through television and then into low-budget pictures, including a biker film at the start of the 1970s, the trajectory running quietly downhill the whole way. His personal life held one bright thread, a marriage to Greta Thysson, a Danish beauty queen turned film actress, the kind of glamorous match that suggested a larger life than his resume ever delivered. They were the kind of couple the magazines should have followed, in a career the magazines mostly ignored. Ron Starr died in December of 2017 in Los Angeles County at around 81. Most performers spend their lives chasing a peak that stays somewhere ahead of them. For this one, the best had already happened in 1962, in a dusty western before the cameras of this little sitcom ever rolled, and he spent the rest of his years walking away from it. 8 men crewed a ship that sailed for 1 season. 6 are gone, 2 remain, and one of them is still on television tonight.